Believe it or not, the American wine industry has only really been famous for about the last 50 years. In the 1970s, California was still very much up and coming, and a lot of folks saw this region as kind of an experimental region where folks were trying to dip their toe into winemaking, but the winemakers were not taken seriously at all. This all changed in 1976 when a British wine merchant hosted a blind tasting called the Judgement of Paris. There were a lot of very famous French wineries whose wines were represented, and then some of the top winemakers in California. Much to everyone's surprise, both the white and red wine categories that won were California winemakers. And this blind tasting shocked the world because it really put California on the map as having some top quality wines. Now, today on the Wine CEO podcast show, I am sitting down with the winemaker from Chateau Montelena. And Chateau Montelena was the infamous winery that won the white wine category of this blind tasting. Hi friends, my name is Sarah. I'm a certified sommelier and host of the Wine CEO podcast. And each week on this channel, I sit down and talk to winemakers, wine industry professionals, or I just share my experience as a certified sommelier about some interesting wine topics that will help make wine a little less intimidating and more fun and approachable. So today on the show, I'm really excited to dive into this really fun topic. I got a chance to visit Chateau Montelena in California, in Calistoga, and it is absolutely beautiful. So let's go ahead and dive into my interview with Matt from Chateau Montelena. Wine CEO podcast listeners, I'm so excited because today I'm in the beautiful Chateau Montelena here in Calistoga, California, and I'm with Matthew Crafton, who is our winemaker at Chateau Montelena. So excited to sit down and have a conversation. So Matt, thanks so much for coming on the Wine CEO podcast today.
Happy to host you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, what would be great first is if you could maybe tell the listeners a little bit about Chateau Montelena, really quick history about the winery, and also how you came to be the winemaker here.
So Chateau Montelena was founded in 1882 by a gentleman named Alfred Tubbs, who was a state senator. And the Tubbs family built this wonderful place, and it thrived essentially until Prohibition, where unfortunately, like so many wineries in California and Napa Valley, shut down, and it became one of the many famous ghost wineries here in the valley. In 1972, Jim Barrett resurrected the castle, the brand, the winery, the vineyard, as part of really the second, or the rebirth of the American wine industry. And then our second vintage of Chardonnay won the famous 1976 Judgement of Paris, which revolutionized the wine world. It put America on the map. It put New World wines on the map. All of a sudden, it became possible, and it became really exciting to think about other wine regions besides France. And so I think we owe a lot of debt, obviously, to the French and the development of the wines we have today. But that was a really fundamental moment in American history.
Very cool. And so how did you come to Chateau Montelena? What's your kind of winemaking background? Did you always want to be in wine?
No, I didn't. It was a very circuitous path, I think, like as it is for most people. Looking back on it, it seems much more linear. But the short answer is that after college, for me, not wanting to go into necessarily a traditional career, what appealed to me about wine was that overlap of creativity, creation. There's a science aspect to it. And then there's just like something like beautiful and altruistic in making something that, I don't know, makes people happy. I also really liked the idea that we haven't really figured out wine. There's so many other disciplines in the world where you feel like there's so much history. There's so many like giants who've gone so far ahead that we could never catch up. Wine, we still don't know a whole lot about, and things are still, the information, the research, everything is still being developed over time. And every year we learn a little bit more. So all of those things were really interesting to me. And so my path started off on the East Coast. I came out here to California, and Bo hired me in 2008 on a 1-year deal. So I'm still working off that. And he promoted me to winemaker in 2014. And so here we are.
Amazing. Very cool. And the Barretts still own, this is a family-owned winery today, right? And I know that one of the focuses has really been sustainability over the last few years. So how do you as the winemaker find this balance between like wanting to try maybe new techniques and like try to be sustainable, but also remain true to maybe like the tradition of this family that has such heritage here? How do you make sure that you're kind of finding the right balance there?
That's a great question. I think the way we look at it is the two really aren't mutually exclusive. Part of our DNA here has always been somewhat of like it's, you could call it a startup, even though it sounds somewhat cliched and maybe somewhat unexpected given a castle from 1882. But the Barretts have always been believed in creativity, in dedication, in coming up with new ideas. We realized that for us, our reputation is rented. It's not earned. We have to pay those rent payments every single month. And so if we're not continuing to innovate, then we lose all relevance and this wonderful family-owned winery could potentially go away. And so I think it really is something that the Barretts instilled in the culture here and in the winery from the outset, that this isn't about looking backwards. It is about looking forwards. And so we can honor our traditions by innovating and by taking what we've done in the past and continuing to build on it. And so that's really what we look at, the way we look at things here.
I love it. So Matt, obviously Chardonnay put you all on the map, but can you talk to us a little bit about the whole wine portfolio here? What are some of the other grapes that you specialize in, and what's something that maybe you love especially talking about?
So obviously Chardonnay, there's a lot of history here, but it wasn't intended to be that way. Chardonnay and white grapes we developed those wines early on to help fund the replant of this historic property. And so it's kind of the running joke that they were basically cash flow wines, and then all of a sudden they got really popular and then very, very famous. So because of that, we obviously did follow through, and we created what I think is one of the most beautiful estates and one of the most productive and high quality estates in Napa Valley. But it really means that we have 1 foot in Burgundy and 1 foot in Bordeaux. Not a whole lot of wineries have that kind of heritage. And so it forces you to think a little bit differently from a winemaking standpoint. But, the way we look at, developments of vineyards and varieties and wines we make, there are really a few things, especially when you start combining terroirs. So you've got what's going on below ground, soil, you've got the geology, the roots. Then you've got what's going on above ground. So we have, the weather, the climate, the wind, the sun exposure, all those things. And then there's the hand of man is the other part. And so from like a very fundamental standpoint for us, we start off with, okay, let's put the right grape in the right place. And I think if you look at this property, if you come and visit, you'll see, okay, we have Zinfandel in some places, Cabernet in others, Cabernet Franc, Petit Syrah. And it's really because that's an area where, based on the terroir, those varieties tend to thrive. And I think, and this ties into the winemaking piece, which is essentially our commitment is that if it's not insanely great, it doesn't go out. So even though we could easily grow, average plus Cabernet in quite a few sites on this property, we can really grow A+ Zinfandel or A+ Petit Syrah there. And so that's what we choose to do, probably foregoing some profit and revenue along the way.
Sure.
But again, it's that long-term commitment that we're focused on, where we want people to understand that when they buy a bottle of Montelena, like, it has to be an A+. And we see that in our members who come here and sign up, where they trust us to the point where we release a new wine and no one's tasted it. There's no history beyond it. There's nothing, but our members buy it, and the public buy those wines because they know that anything we release is going to be insanely great.
I love how you said that the winery doesn't rest on its laurels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just because there was this amazing publicity after the 1976 Judgment of Paris, it doesn't mean that you like only focus on Chardonnay and that's like, the end for Chateau Montelena. But I love that you all keep pushing the limits to try and like stay on top of maybe new trends or knowing what grapes need to be planted in certain areas instead of just following the cash cow. So you mentioned like 1 foot in Bordeaux and 1 foot in Burgundy. How do you as a winemaker try to like balance all of that? Because obviously it's a lot to work through when you have tons of varieties and you're working through obviously different, soil expositions, and you're trying to then, when it comes to the actual winemaking, balance out the right profile for these different grapes. So what do you do to keep yourself, I guess, up on new techniques and to make sure that you're staying as sharp as you can to deliver the best of these different grapes in their natural profile?
That's also a great question. I think for us, it starts off with keeping things very simple. So we don't make 15 different wines here. We make 6. So we have 2 Cabernets, 1 Chardonnay, Zinfandel, Riesling, and a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc. That's it. And when we put these wines together, they're never to hit a specific price point in the market. There isn't really anything driven by sales. There's no focus groups. There's nothing like that. It is literally like a singular creative expression. And so we look at it's from a very fundamental standpoint. We look at, well, what is the potential of this site and what can we do to express that? I have a very easy job from the standpoint of building very transparent wines that age, which is really the only mandates we ever get from our ownership. And our owners are wonderful, wonderful people. They say, make delicious wines and make them age. And then we get to kind of color between within the lines that way. And so when you don't have to hit a stylistic profile every year, when you don't have to hit necessarily a specific market segment, all of a sudden, like the world is wide open from a creative and a winemaking standpoint. And so when I think about all the different varieties we work with, it's really about how do we take the growing season, the warmth, the cool evenings, the fog, whether or not we got any rain during the winter time, all of those individual aspects that make every single vintage unique. How do we take that and then distill it down into that wine? We say, when I talk to my crew, I remind them that we grow little bottles of wine in the vineyard, and that every wine needs to be, the expression of the wine in your glass needs to be an expression of that entire vintage. So by staying very focused on that, it opens up, again, all of these possibilities and all of these different tools we can use, but with that very specific goal. I know that's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question.
It's great. And do you focus exclusively on single vintage wines?
Yes.
Then? Okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, nice. So when you're talking about ageability, like we've talked in the show in the past about, aging wines is personal preference. You might love younger wine, you might love it aged. When you're looking for ageability in a wine, what profile are you looking for?
So it really depends on the wine. And I think you're absolutely right. There's some folks who love the freshness, the kind of the young, beautiful primary vineyard characteristics in a brand new release of Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay. And then we meet people who appreciate some of the tertiary, the aged characteristics in our wines that can take 20 to 30 years to develop. So the challenge from the winemaking side is, how do we make the wine delicious in all of those individual phases as the wine matures over time? And so from an ageability standpoint, there's a lot of like voodoo and magic that people talk about, but the reality is it's complicated, but it's chemistry.
Okay.
And the complicated things can be solved because they're somewhat sequential, and it's not that exciting. But really what it comes down to is, do you have the right site that lends itself to creating ageable wines? And if you do have that site, do you have the long-term focus to create wines that can age and do get better with time? And so for us, thankfully, we have both. And it's challenging because there's certain vintages where, like when I'm making our blends, for instance, I'm thinking about not necessarily what this wine is going to taste like when it's immediately released. I'm thinking about, well, what is this wine going to taste like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years? And part of that is, again, understanding the vineyard. Part of it is understanding, the science side of it. That's really important. And then there's the final part is just having that ability, that willingness to take a risk and saying, what I think I'm doing now is going to eventually achieve the result I want. And so that's how we look at it.
That makes sense. And I'm guessing as a winemaker, vintage after vintage, you kind of start to build a history, right? Like
Sure.
that Rolodex in your mind of what you're looking for and what you need to taste like and how things evolve over time.
Definitely. And I think there's definitely some reassurance in being able to taste through fruit, having that long-term perspective of saying, okay, well, this, like the profile of this wine or this tank reminds me of 2013. And in 2013, we did A, B, and C, and A worked and B worked, but C did not work at all. So let's not do that. So there's a little bit of a heuristic when it comes to that. But that said, it ends at the point where we don't sit down and, let's say, like before I make my final blends, there are a lot of winemakers who will sit down and they'll taste like the 10 vintage previous and they'll say, okay, does it fit in the family? I have no interest in that at all. Every wine stands on its own. And that can be confusing, especially to Americans, because there are wines that we love because every vintage is exactly the same. It's like, and I have a friend who makes a wine like that, and it's an inexpensive grocery store wine. And it's really hard to make because the fruit's different every year, the vintage is different every year, and he has to hit this wine that hits the same flavor every year. It's a very technically challenging wine. Our challenge is the opposite. Like, how do we make these wines captivating? How do you say like, wow, I can really taste the warmth of the vintage, or the acidity from that cool vintage is really magical. But at the same time, we have to weave all of those wines together so that they're recognizable as Montelena. So it's a very unique challenge. It can be frustrating, and it can be like very nebulous, but it requires like absolute focus and then that level of confidence that we believe in what we're doing and the risks we're taking to get there.
I love it. And I'm sure that this comes through in the way that you really are set apart from other wineries in the Valley, right? Because there's a lot of wineries here. Obviously, there's a lot of wines coming out of Napa and Sonoma, but obviously Chateau Montelena continues to have such an incredible reputation, a lot for that reason, I'm sure.
And thank you. And I mean, I think we recognize we're very fortunate. We had this amazing event in our history. It's almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And while I think it's wonderful that the Judgement of Paris still brings people here, I realize that the vast majority of our new customers weren't even alive at that point. And so for them, it's an interesting note in history, but they're not necessarily willing to go and buy a bottle because of it. They're tasting what's here right now. What have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
So we have to live up to that standard, and we have to exceed it.
I love it. You talked about this massive replanting that's been done somewhat, recently. So walk us through, what did that mean for the winery, and how's that kind of changed things from where it was a few decades ago?
So that's a big part of what we're working on right now. And so beginning in 2018, Bobert, our CEO, gave us the green light to undertake what is the biggest replant of the 100 acres here on property since the original planting in 1972. And it's amazing how much viticulture, grape growing, winemaking has evolved since then in the last 50 years. We have so much more information. We have a lot of data, but we also have a lot of noise. But we have a lot of familiarity with this place too. So we essentially said, okay, so what do we know and what do we don't know? And the things that we don't know, can we figure some of those things out? Is there a way to, through investigating the soil and, analytical methods, can we learn more about this very specific place? And we took all that information and we used that to redevelop this property. And it's a multi-year process. We can't just rip everything out and start over. Grapevines take 3-4 years before they start producing. So it's a phased project, but we're seeing, new rootstocks, new row orientations, new clones, everything in this entire process is for one specific goal, which is quality. That's it. And so that's very refreshing from a winemaking standpoint, where there's no mandate to say, okay, we need to grow 20% by volume per year. No, we need to grow by making our wines better every single year. And I'm the hardest one to please. And so it's been a really edifying experience, because we've seen how with some of the first vines came online last year from that 2018 planting. And after all the build up to this, everything we've put into it, making that first vintage was just amazing. And it was everything we'd hoped it would be. And so the process probably won't be finished for another 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
But it's something to look forward to.
That's awesome.
It's crazy, right? I mean, how many things in life you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited about what we're going to do in 2029.
Yeah, right? You got to really plan for it and then taste it.
It is.
Yeah, but wine in general, I feel like is kind of that, right? Like there's, delayed gratification in 100%. A lot of winemaking, right? And wine, enjoyment. So I love that. It's always good to have things on the horizon to look forward to.
Definitely.
That's awesome. So one of the things I'd love to ask you about is wine ratings.
Sure.
Because I feel like, obviously, coming from the history that you have, so clearly the Chardonnay as well as other wines here have received amazing ratings from many, wine professionals and incredible, PR outlets. What are your thoughts on ratings? Because I feel like I'm seeing the world of ratings disappear a little bit, where consumers don't seem to really rely on them as much. And I think we're seeing a decline in general. So what are your thoughts on all of that as someone who's making wine for a very well-known winery in California that has maybe benefited a lot from that PR in the past?
There's no question we have. And we owe a debt of gratitude to Robert Parker and really the development of educating the American public during the 1980s and 1990s. But to your point, all that education has led to, I think, a more informed American consumer. The way I like to describe it is I ask folks, like, do you how often do you read like movie critics reviews? And like, there are some folks who do, but they're fewer and fewer every year. Like when I was a kid, there was like Siskel and Ebert and stuff like that, and people like that, and Rolling Stone, but you see less of it. I think people are much more confident in terms of what their preferences are on the one hand. The other piece of it is that there's just a lot more information that's available. And so we still really do enjoy talking to wine journalists. I really specifically enjoy talking to the ones who aren't here just to put a numerical score on something, because that's just, their preference. And if your palate corresponds or correlates with them, maybe that's all you want. But I find that the wine journalists who are, I think, really making inroads and are still relevant are the ones who want to come out and want to walk the vineyard and want to talk about perspective and what we're working on. They're asking the why questions. I mean, taking something like this on a fundamental level and reducing it to a two-digit score, I think we're past that.
Yeah.
And so it's for me, I get excited when a journalist comes out or a writer comes out and they want to pick up the dirt like I do, and they want to talk about the clones. They want to talk about why our vineyards are oriented 25 degrees east of north, and what the overall plan is and the perspective and how we view ageability, pretty much all the things we're talking about right now. You can't get that in a snapshot.
Yeah.
And so that makes me hopeful and makes me excited, because I think American wine consumers are getting more interested in that. And I think the second piece of it is that I think in general, the people I talk to really care a lot about values. And I think we're very grateful that so many people want to support this small family-owned brand. I think there's this kind of innate interest of people to kind of support places like this. And then I think there's also a very strong, American part of this brand, which I love, because it's very much like a hardworking, can-do attitude. You mentioned sustainability. I mean, it's been part of our DNA since the very beginning. And, you can distill it down to, let's leave this place better than how we found it. And so I think on a very fundamental level, that brings people together. And we really think that's important. And again, tying back to journalism, that doesn't go into a score.
Totally.
It's bigger than that.
Totally agree. I love it. Well, Matt, this has been amazing. If there's one thing that you're really looking forward to in 2025, what are you excited about? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So one thing, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you a couple little things, but I think that they're exciting. So we have some really fun new members only wines coming out. I'm not going to tease them here, but if you come find us, you can see them. We have some new experiences for when you come in. The last one is really just the fact that coming to see us here at the winery, it's we have this amazing library, and every year we make more and more of it available to our members and people who come and visit.
I love it. Very cool.
Yeah.
And I will definitely link everything for coming to visit Chateau Montelena.
Sure.
This is beautiful, by the way. What's the Asian influence? This is Jade Lake, and there's a lot of beautiful architecture. What's the kind of nod to that in the history of the winery?
So between when the Tubbs family shut the winery down in Prohibition and when Jim Barrett purchased the property, the winery was owned by a Chinese family who used the castle as their house. The Yort and Jeannie Frank were their names, and Yort, because he had a castle, decided he wanted a moat. And so he literally dug out what we call Jade Lake. His wife, her name was Jeannie, and her nickname was Jade. And so that's where this beautiful lake came from, and these beautiful pavilions.
Very cool.
It's a lot of cool history.
Well, there's swans. I mean, pictures don't do it justice. So I will definitely have pictures, but truly you all have to come visit Chateau Montelena. It's absolutely incredible. Matt, thank you so much. Cheers.
Hey,
This was fabulous.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed my episode today. It was so wonderful to get to visit Chateau Montelena. I have to give a huge shout out to Matt and the team there for being such wonderful hosts. It's a beautiful property. The only way to visit is to join their wine club and be able to visit their beautiful winery, but I highly recommend it because it is stunning and their wines really are amazing. I cannot say enough good things about Chateau Montelena. They really are not resting on their laurels post their amazing history of winning the 1976 Paris Judgment. They truly are trailblazing in Northern California and making some amazing wines to this day. If you want to learn more about Chateau Montelena, check out some of the show notes from today's episode. There's some great links there so that you can learn a little bit more about the winery, about their story from the Judgment of Paris, and also other ways to get in contact with the winery and to follow along with the great things that they are doing there. Until next week, friends, I hope you drink something new and delicious, and I will catch you all in the next episode of the Wine CEO Podcast.